They called her too big for town, too much woman for decent folks, but when they put her on the auction block like livestock, Marcus Kane saw what they couldn't, a heart worth more than all their narrow minds combined. And he'd be damned if he'd let them break the only woman who'd ever looked at him like he was more than just another broken cowboy. The gavel came down with the sound of thunder splitting summer sky, and Sarah Mitchell felt her world crack clean in half. Sold to the highest bidder for $37.50, the auctioneer called out, his voice cutting through the crowd like a rusty blade. Widow Mitchell and her property rights transferred to Jeremiah Cobb, effective immediately. The words hit Sarah harder than her late husband's fists ever had, and that was saying something. She stood on the courthouse steps in her worn black dress, watching the vultures circle closer as Jeremiah Cobb pushed through the crowd with that snake-oil smile she'd learned to fear. Sarah knew what this meant. Jeremiah had been sniffing around her land for months, making offers that sounded generous until you read the fine print that would leave her with nothing but the clothes on her back. When she'd refused, he'd called in her late husband's debts she never knew existed, debts that somehow multiplied like rabbits in spring until they swallowed her 100-acre spread whole. The town had watched it happen with the kind of hungry eyes that fed on other people's misery, whispering behind their hands about how Sarah Mitchell had always been too big, too loud, too much trouble for a proper Christian community. "Now, Sarah," Jeremiah said, stepping close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and the greed in his sweat, "you just gather up what you can carry and be off my land by sundown. I'm feeling generous today." His hand reached out toward her arm, and Sarah jerked back like she'd touched a hot iron. The crowd pressed closer, sensing entertainment, sensing blood in the water. These were people she'd known for 15 years, people she'd helped through hard winters and harder births, people who'd eaten at her table and borrowed her strength when they had none of their own. Now they watched her destruction like it was a traveling show come to town. But then a voice cut through the vulture circle noise, quiet but carrying the kind of authority that made even Jeremiah Cobb take a step back. "I believe there's been a mistake," the voice said, and Sarah turned to see a man she'd noticed at the edge of the crowd but hadn't really looked at until now. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that spoke of honest work rather than soft living, with dark hair that caught the sun, and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the mountains. Marcus Kane, she realized, the rancher who'd moved into the old Henderson place 6 months back, the one who kept to himself and minded his own business while the town gossips tried to figure out his story. Marcus stepped forward through the crowd that parted reluctantly, like water around a stone. "The auction notice said property and debts," he said, his voice steady as church bells on Sunday morning. "Didn't mention anything about a person being sold." His eyes found Sarah's across the sea of disappointed faces, and something passed between them, something that made her stand a little straighter despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. Jeremiah's face went red as a sunset, his jaw working like he was chewing nails. "Now see here, Kane, this ain't your concern. The widow's debts are tied to her person same as her property. That's how these things work when folks get in over their heads." But Marcus just smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes but somehow managed to make Jeremiah take another step backward. "Funny thing about debt law," Marcus said, pulling a folded paper from his vest pocket. "I've been doing some reading, and according to territorial statute, personal debt can only transfer with personal consent. Mrs. Mitchell, did you consent to having your person sold along with your property?" Sarah felt the world tilt sideways as every eye in that crowd turned to her, waiting to see if she'd fight or fold, waiting to see if the woman they'd called too big would make herself small enough to fit in their neat little boxes. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, and her mouth went dry as desert sand. This was her moment, her choice, her chance to either disappear quietly into whatever life Jeremiah Cobb had planned for her or stand up and declare that Sarah Mitchell might be down but she sure as hell wasn't broken. "No," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but then she cleared her throat and tried again. No, I did not consent to any such thing. The crowd stirred like hornets whose nest had been kicked, and Jeremiah's face went from red to purple. This is ridiculous, he sputtered, but Marcus was already unfolding his paper and handing it to the auctioneer, who read it with growing confusion and what might have been relief. What's this supposed to be? Jeremiah demanded, snatching the paper and scanning it with eyes that grew wider and angrier with each word. Bill of sale, Marcus said simply, for the Mitchell property, debts, and all associated holdings, paid in full as of this morning. Sarah's knees nearly buckled as the words sank in. This stranger, this man she'd barely spoken to beyond neighborly pleasantries, had somehow bought her entire life out from under Jeremiah Cobb's grasping fingers. But why? What did he want from her? What did any man want from a woman in her position? Jeremiah crumpled the paper and threw it at Marcus's feet. "This is fraud," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I had the winning bid, fair and square." But the auctioneer was already shaking his head, looking like a man who'd just been saved from drowning and wasn't about to question the rope that pulled him out. "Prior lien takes precedence," the auctioneer said, his voice stronger now that he had legal ground to stand on. "Mr. Kane's claim predates the auction by 48 hours. The sale to Mr. Cobb is hereby voided." The crowd erupted in confused murmuring, some folks looking disappointed that their entertainment had been cut short, others looking relieved that Sarah Mitchell wouldn't be carted off like a piece of furniture after all. Sarah stared at Marcus Kane, trying to read the expression on his weathered face, trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for her future. He bent down to retrieve the crumpled paper, smoothing it out with careful fingers before folding it and tucking it back into his vest. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice gentler now, meant for her ears alone despite the crowd pressing close to hear every word. "I wonder if you might ride out to my place when you're ready. We have some things to discuss." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked, her voice stronger now but still shaky around the edges. She was grateful, more grateful than she had words for, but gratitude and trust were two different animals entirely, and she'd learned the hard way not to confuse them. Marcus's eyes softened, and for a moment Sarah saw something there that looked almost like understanding, like he knew exactly what she was thinking and didn't blame her for it. "The kind of things that are better discussed in private," he said, glancing meaningfully at the crowd of eager listeners surrounding them. "With coffee and common sense instead of an audience looking for gossip to chew on." Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing wisdom when she heard it. Whatever Marcus Kane wanted from her, whatever price he expected for his unexpected rescue, it would be better to hear it away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of Millfield's finest citizens. "I'll be along directly," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Marcus touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be respectful without being servile, then turned and walked away through the crowd that parted reluctantly before him. Sarah watched him go, noting the confident way he carried himself, the way he didn't look back to see if she was still watching. A man sure of himself and his place in the world, or at least good at pretending to be. Jeremiah Cobb stepped into her line of sight, his face twisted with rage and something uglier. "This ain't over, Sarah," he hissed, close enough that she could see the broken blood vessels in his eyes. "You think you're so smart, finding yourself a protector, but men like Kane don't do nothing for free. When he's done with you, you'll come crawling back begging for my original offer." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, this man who tried to buy her like cattle, who'd spoken of her as property to be transferred and used. "Maybe," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough steel to make him blink. "But that'll be my choice to make, won't it?" She turned away from his sputtering protests and began walking toward her wagon, feeling the weight of a dozen stares boring into her back. Behind her, she heard the crowd beginning to disperse, their entertainment over, their gossip mill stocked with enough material to keep them busy for weeks. As Sarah climbed onto her wagon seat and gathered the reins, she caught sight of Marcus Kane riding out of town on a bay gelding that looked like it could run all day and still have strength left over. He didn't look back, but somehow Sarah felt like he was aware of her watching, like he was giving her time to think, Time to decide whether she was ready to trust a stranger with whatever remained of her life. The sun was starting its slide toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that reminded Sarah of better days, days when the future had seemed full of possibility, instead of just another series of things to survive. She clucked to her horses and followed the dusty road out of town, wondering what she'd find waiting for her at Marcus Kane's ranch, wondering if she was riding towards salvation or just trading one kind of trouble for another. Behind her, Millfield settled into its afternoon routine, but Sarah could feel the whispers following her like smoke on the wind, and she knew that whatever happened next, her life had just taken a turn down a road she'd never imagined walking. The Kane ranch stretched out before Sarah like a promise she wasn't sure she dared believe in. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle, a sturdy two-story house that spoke of permanence rather than the makeshift desperation that marked so many frontier homes, and barns that looked like they'd been built to last generations rather than just seasons. Sarah pulled her wagon to a stop in the yard, noting the way everything seemed purposeful, planned, cared for. This wasn't the spread of a man who'd stumbled into ranching by accident or desperation. This was the work of someone who understood land and how to make it thrive. Marcus appeared on the front porch before she'd even finished setting the brake, moving with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. He'd changed from his town clothes into working gear, leather chaps over worn denim, a shirt that had seen honest labor, boots that had walked through more than just Sunday services. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called, stepping down from the porch with his hat in his hands. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Wasn't sure myself until I was halfway here," Sarah replied, climbing down from the wagon with as much dignity as her worn dress and frayed nerves would allow. "But curiosity got the better of good sense, I suppose." She stood in his yard, suddenly aware of how she must look after the ordeal in town, her hair escaping its pins, her dress wrinkled from stress and sweat, her hands shaking just enough to betray how close to breaking she really was. Marcus nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Come inside," he said gently. "Coffee's still hot and we've got talking to do." He gestured toward the house, but didn't reach for her arm or try to guide her, giving her the space to make her own choices. Sarah appreciated that more than she could say. After years of being told where to go and what to do, having someone respect her autonomy felt like cool water after days in the desert. The interior of the house surprised her. She'd expected the stark functionality that marked most bachelor dwellings, but instead found rooms that spoke of comfort and care. Real furniture, not just crates and rough boards, curtains at the windows, books on shelves, a kitchen that looked like it was used for more than just heating beans and coffee. "You live well for a single man," Sarah observed, accepting the chair he offered at a table that could seat 6 comfortably. "Had help setting up," Marcus said, pouring coffee from a pot that smelled like heaven and looked strong enough to wake the dead. "Woman in town, Mrs. Patterson, helped me get things arranged proper like when I first arrived. Said a man's house reflects his character, and she wasn't about to let me reflect poorly on her recommendations." Sarah knew Mrs. Patterson, a widow herself who took in sewing and didn't suffer fools gladly. If she'd approved of Marcus Kane enough to help him set up housekeeping, that said something significant about the man's character. Marcus settled across from her with his own cup, steam rising between them like incense in a church. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd lived long enough to understand that some conversations couldn't be rushed, that important words needed time to settle before they could be spoken properly. Sarah used the quiet to study his face, looking for the tells that would reveal his true intentions. She'd gotten good at reading men's faces over the years, necessity teaching her to spot danger before it spotted her. What she saw surprised her. Patience, yes, but also something that looked like loneliness, like a man who'd been carrying burdens alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to share the weight. His hands wrapped around his coffee cup were scarred from honest work, not the soft hands of a man who made his living off other people's labor. There was gray threading through his dark hair despite him not looking much past 40, and lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into too many sunsets, watching too many horizons for things that might never come. "Why?" Sarah asked finally, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. "Why did you buy my debts? Why did you save me from Jeremiah Cobb? What do you want from me?" The questions came out harder than she'd intended, but she was past the point of pretty politeness. She needed answers, needed to understand what kind of cage she'd traded Jeremiah's for. Marcus took a long sip of his coffee, considering his words carefully. "Jeremiah Cobb is the kind of man who sees people as things to be used," he said finally. "I've known men like him before, and I've seen what they do to the people who fall into their hands, especially women." Something dark flickered across his face, a shadow of memory that made Sarah's breath catch. No one deserves that, not even someone they call too big for polite society. "That doesn't answer my question," Sarah pressed, leaning forward. "What do you want from me? Men don't buy other people's troubles out of the goodness of their hearts. There's always a price, always something expected in return." She'd learned that lesson the hard way, learned that every kindness came with strings attached, every rescue had a cost that somehow always seemed higher than what she'd been rescued from. Marcus met her eyes steadily, and Sarah saw no deception there, no shifty calculation of a man preparing to spring his trap. "I want to offer you a choice," he said simply, "something I don't think you've had much of lately." He stood and walked to a window that looked out over his pastures, his back straight but not rigid. "I need help running this place. It's too much for one man, and hiring hands is getting expensive. You've been running your own spread for 3 years since your husband died, so you know the work, know what needs doing." Sarah felt her heart start to pound, but she couldn't tell if it was from hope or fear. "What kind of help?" she asked carefully. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Kane?" The silence stretched between them like a tightrope she wasn't sure she dared walk across. "Partnership," Marcus said, turning back to face her. "You work the ranch with me, 50-50 split of the profits after expenses. You keep your independence, make your own choices, come and go as you please. There's a cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house, small but sound. You'd have your own space, your own life." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "And if it doesn't work out, if you decide you'd rather move on, the debts I bought stay paid regardless. You'd be free to go wherever you wanted without owing anyone anything." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. It sounded too good to be true, and in her experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually were. "And what do you get out of it?" she asked. "Besides help with the ranch work?" Because there had to be more. There was always more. Marcus returned to his chair, his movements deliberate and calm. "Honestly, company," he said. "I've been alone on this place for 6 months, and it gets to wearing on a man. Someone to talk to over supper, someone who understands the work and can make decisions when I'm not here. Someone who won't treat me like I'm either a saint or a sinner, just a man trying to make a living off the land." He met her eyes again. "And maybe someone who understands what it's like to be judged by people who have never walked in your boots." Sarah felt something twist in her chest, recognition of a pain she knew too well. "The town talks about you too," she said, and it wasn't a question. She'd seen how some folks looked at Marcus, with the kind of suspicion reserved for outsiders who didn't fit neatly into their predetermined categories. "They do," Marcus confirmed. "They say I'm too secretive, too standoffish. They wonder where I came from, why I paid cash for this place, why I don't socialize more. They've decided I'm either running from something or hiding something, maybe both." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Truth is simpler and probably more disappointing than anything they've imagined. I worked cattle drives for 15 years, saved every penny I could, and finally had enough to buy my own place. But simple truth never makes for good gossip. And they say I'm too big, too independent, too much trouble for any decent man to handle," Sarah said, surprised by how easily the words came. "They've been waiting for me to fail ever since James died, waiting for me to prove that a woman can't run a ranch alone." She laughed, but it came out bitter and sharp. "Looks like they finally got their wish." Did they? Marcus asked quietly. Seems to me you ran that place just fine until Jeremiah decided he wanted it bad enough to manufacture reasons to take it. That's not failure, Mrs. Mitchell. That's theft dressed up in legal papers. The conviction in his voice caught Sarah off guard, made something warm unfurl in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she cared to remember. They sat in silence again, but it felt different this time, less like two strangers circling each other warily, and more like two people who'd recognized something familiar in each other's eyes. Sarah found herself actually considering his offer, actually imagining what it might be like to work alongside someone instead of constantly fighting alone against the world's attempts to grind her down. "The cabin you mentioned," she said finally. "I could come and go as I pleased, make my own decisions about my life." Because that was the heart of it, the thing she'd lost when she married James and had never quite gotten back even after he died. The right to decide for herself what her days would look like, what risks she'd take, what dreams she'd chase. "Your life, your choices," Marcus confirmed. "I'm offering partnership, not ownership. You'd be Sarah Mitchell, not Mrs. Somebody else's property." The distinction hit her harder than she'd expected, brought tears to her eyes that she blinked back fiercely. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited. "And if I said yes," Sarah continued, her voice stronger now, "if I agreed to this arrangement, what would people say? What would they think about a widow woman living on a bachelor's ranch, working alongside him like an equal?" Because she knew what they'd think, knew exactly what kind of stories would spread through Millfield like wildfire in dry grass. Marcus shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both understanding and dismissal of the town's narrow minds. "They'd think what they wanted to think regardless of the truth," he said. "They'd probably say we were living in sin, that I was taking advantage of your desperate situation, that you were no better than you should be. They'd whisper and point and make up stories to fill in whatever details they couldn't see for themselves." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "But they're not living your life, Sarah. You are, and you're the only one who gets to decide what that life looks like." Sarah felt her breath catch at the sound of her name on his lips, spoken without the formal distance of Mrs. Mitchell, spoken like she was a real person rather than a title to be handled carefully. "You make it sound simple," she said, but her heart was already leaning toward yes, toward the possibility of something different, something better than just surviving from one disaster to the next. "Simple isn't the same as easy," Marcus replied. "This life, this choice, it won't be simple. It'll be hard work, long days, and probably more gossip than either of us wants to deal with. But it'll be honest work, and it'll be your choice to do it." He stood and walked to a cabinet, returning with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "What do you say we drink to new beginnings, whatever they might look like?" Sarah stared at the glasses, at the amber liquid that caught the afternoon light streaming through his windows, at the man who just offered her something she'd thought was lost forever. "Hope. To new beginnings," she said, accepting the glass he offered. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a clean burn, like everything else about Marcus Kane's offer seemed to be. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Sarah of all the sunsets she'd watched alone, wondering if tomorrow would bring anything worth seeing. For the first time in months, maybe years, she found herself actually looking forward to finding out. 3 weeks into their partnership, Sarah discovered that Marcus Kane talked to his horses like they were old friends sharing secrets, and the sound of his low laughter drifting from the barn made something in her chest flutter like wings against glass. She was mending fence on the north pasture when she heard it, a rich, warm sound that seemed to wrap around her ribs and squeeze gently. Sarah paused in her work, hammer suspended mid-swing, listening to him coax a stubborn mare into her stall with promises of extra oats and gentle teasing about her vanity. The cabin he'd promised turned out to be a small gem tucked into a grove of cottonwoods, with a stone fireplace that drew properly and windows that caught both the sunrise and sunset. Sarah had spent her first night there lying awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of peace, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Marcus to show up at her door demanding payment for his generosity. But he never came. 3 weeks of honest work, shared meals, and careful conversation had passed without a single demand, without a single moment where his eyes lingered too long or his hands strayed where they shouldn't. It was almost enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, some men actually meant what they said when they offered partnership instead of ownership. Almost enough, but not quite. Sarah had learned too well that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the price of being wrong was everything she'd fought so hard to rebuild. The work itself surprised her with its rhythm, its natural division of labor that had nothing to do with what was proper for a woman and everything to do with what needed doing. Marcus handled the heavy lifting and the more temperamental cattle, while Sarah managed the books, planned the feeding schedules, and dealt with the merchants in town who seemed more comfortable negotiating with a woman than with the mysterious Marcus Kane. They worked side by side in comfortable silence most days, but when they talked, Sarah found herself looking forward to his opinions on everything from cattle breeding to the quality of this year's hay crop. But it was the evenings that caught her off guard, the times when work was done and they'd find themselves lingering over coffee on his front porch, watching the stars come out one by one over the mountains. Marcus had a way of asking questions that made her actually want to answer them, questions about her dreams rather than her failures, about the things that made her laugh instead of the things that made her cry. He told stories about his cattle drive days, about places he'd seen and people he'd met, painting pictures with words that made Sarah feel like she was traveling alongside him across all those miles of open country. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Marcus seemed restless, distracted, glancing toward the main road more often than usual. Sarah was in the kitchen of the main house, helping him prepare supper, when she finally couldn't ignore his nervous energy any longer. "You expecting company?" she asked, pausing in her potato peeling to study his face. Marcus froze, his knife halfway through an onion, and something flickered across his expression that looked almost like guilt. "Might be," he said carefully, not meeting her eyes. "Got a telegram yesterday that someone might be passing through." Sarah felt her stomach drop, that familiar cold recognition that something was about to change, that the peace she'd been foolish enough to start believing in was about to be shattered by whatever Marcus had been hiding from her. "What kind of someone?" she pressed, setting down her knife and turning to face him fully. "And why do you look like you're about to tell me something I don't want to hear?" Because she'd seen that expression before, on James's face when he was preparing to deliver news that would turn her world upside down, on the banker's face when he'd explained about the foreclosure, on Jeremiah Cobb's face when he'd told her about the auction. Marcus set down his own knife and leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair in the gesture she'd learned meant he was working up to something difficult. "Her name is Catherine," he said finally. "Catherine Kane. She's my wife." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her grip the edge of the counter to keep from staggering. Wife. Of course. Of course there was a wife somewhere, because men like Marcus Kane didn't stay unmarried, didn't offer partnership to desperate widows out of the goodness of their hearts. "Your wife," Sarah repeated, her voice sounding strange and distant even to her own ears. "The wife you forgot to mention when you offered me this partnership, the wife who apparently doesn't live here with you." She could hear the edge creeping into her voice, the sharp brittleness that came when she felt cornered and betrayed. "Were you planning to tell me about her eventually, or was I supposed to figure it out when she showed up for supper?" "Sarah, it's not what you think," Marcus said quickly, reaching toward her, but Sarah stepped back, needing space to process this revelation, needing distance from the man who just revealed himself to be yet another liar in a world full of them. "Catherine and we've been separated for 2 years. She went back east to her family, said she couldn't stand the frontier life, couldn't stand being married to a man who'd rather talk to cattle than civilized people." "Separated," Sarah said, tasting the word like it was poison. "But still married, still legally bound to each other." The implications crashed over her like a cold wave. Every evening they'd spent talking on his porch, every shared laugh, every moment when she'd caught herself thinking maybe she'd finally found someone who saw her as more than just a burden or an opportunity. It had all been built on a lie. Not just a lie of omission, but a fundamental deception about who he was and what he could offer. Yes, still married, Marcus admitted, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. But Sarah, that doesn't change anything between us. The partnership I offered you, it's still real, still valid. Catherine signing the divorce papers doesn't affect your place here. But Sarah was already shaking her head, already backing toward the door, because it changed everything. It changed the way their conversations felt, the way his kindness had seemed to promise something more than just business arrangement, the way she'd started to hope that maybe she'd found not just work but belonging. Doesn't change anything. Sarah's voice rose higher than she intended, months of suppressed emotion finally finding an outlet. It changes everything, Marcus, everything. Do you know what people will say when they find out I'm living on a married man's ranch? Do you know what that makes me in their eyes? But even as she said it, she knew the gossip wasn't the real wound. The real wound was deeper, was the knowledge that she'd started to trust him, started to believe that maybe he was different from all the other men who disappointed her. I don't give a damn what people say, Marcus said fiercely, stepping toward her again. And neither should you. We know the truth of what this is, what we are to each other. That's what matters. But Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes even as he spoke, could see that he understood exactly how this looked, exactly what kind of position he'd put her in without bothering to ask if she wanted to be there. The truth, Sarah repeated bitterly. The truth is that you lied to me. Maybe not outright, maybe not with words, but you let me believe something that wasn't real. You let me start to trust you, start to hope for things that a married man has no business offering. She grabbed her shawl from the hook by the door, needing to get out of this house, needing air and space and time to think clearly. Sarah, wait, Marcus called, following her to the door. Let me explain about Catherine, about why she's coming, about what this means. But Sarah was already outside, already walking toward her cabin with quick, angry steps that carried all the frustration and disappointment she couldn't put into words. What it means, she called back over her shoulder, is that I've been a fool. Again. She didn't look back to see if he was following, didn't want to see the expression on his face, didn't want to give him another chance to explain away the fundamental fact that he'd built their entire relationship on a foundation of half-truths and omissions. Back in her cabin, Sarah paced the small room like a caged animal, her mind racing through all the conversations they'd had, all the moments when he could have told her the truth, but chose not to. She remembered asking him directly about his past, about why he'd come to this place, and how he deflected her questions with stories about cattle drives and saving money. She remembered the way he'd talked about loneliness, about wanting company, and how he'd made it sound like he was a bachelor who'd simply never found the right woman to share his life with. A knock on her door interrupted her furious pacing. Sarah, Marcus's voice came through the thin wood, cautious but determined. Please let me explain. Please let me tell you about Catherine, about what really happened between us. Sarah stared at the door, torn between her desire to hear his explanation and her certainty that whatever he told her would just be another version of a story she'd heard too many times before. Talk, she said finally, not opening the door but settling into the chair by her fireplace. But don't expect me to like what you have to say. She heard him lean against the door, heard the soft thud of his forehead hitting the wood. Catherine and I met in Denver, Marcus began, his voice muffled but audible through the door. She was the daughter of a banker, used to fine things, city life, society parties. I was just a cowhand with dreams of having my own spread someday. We courted for 6 months, married in a big church wedding that cost her father more than I made in 2 years. Sarah closed her eyes, trying not to picture Marcus in wedding clothes, trying not to imagine him promising to love and honor another woman until death parted them. She came west with me when I bought this place, Marcus continued. But she hated everything about it. The isolation, the work, the way frontier society operates. She said I'd tricked her, made her think I was something I wasn't, said I'd promised her a civilized life and delivered her into barbarism. There was pain in his voice now, real hurt that Sarah couldn't help but recognize. She tried to change me, tried to make me into the man she thought she'd married. When that didn't work, she went home to her family and filed for separation. But not divorce, Sarah pointed out, her voice sharper than she intended. Separation isn't divorce, Marcus. Separation means you're still married, still bound to each other, still not free to make promises to other people. Even as she said it, she wondered what promises she thought he'd made to her, what commitments she'd imagined in their careful partnership. She wouldn't agree to divorce, Marcus admitted. Said it would ruin her reputation back east, make her unmarriageable to the kind of man her family wanted her to find. So we've been in limbo for 2 years, neither married nor free, both of us stuck in something that died long before she got on that train back to Denver. Sarah heard him shift against the door, heard the weariness in his voice that spoke of carrying this burden alone for too long. And now she's coming back, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Why? What does she want after 2 years of separation? Because women like Catherine Kane, women from banking families who cared about reputation and society, didn't just show up on frontier ranches without good reason. Her telegram said she wants to discuss our situation, Marcus replied. Said circumstances have changed, that we need to talk face to face about the future. Sarah could hear the confusion in his voice, the uncertainty of a man who'd thought he knew where he stood only to have the ground shift beneath his feet. I don't know what she wants, Sarah. I honest to God don't know. Sarah stared at the door, trying to process everything he'd told her, trying to separate her hurt feelings from the practical realities of the situation. The truth was, Marcus had offered her partnership, not marriage. He'd never promised her anything beyond work and independence and freedom from debt. The feelings she'd started to develop, the hope that had begun growing in her chest like wildflowers after rain, those had been her own creation, her own foolish assumption that shared work and comfortable conversation meant something more than they actually did. When is she arriving? Sarah asked finally, her voice calmer now but still distant. Tomorrow afternoon, on the stage from Denver, Marcus replied. Sarah, I want you to know that whatever she wants, whatever she's planning, it doesn't change what I offered you. This partnership, your place here, it's still real. It's still yours if you want it. But Sarah could hear the uncertainty beneath his words, could hear that he wasn't entirely sure he'd be in a position to honor that promise once his wife arrived. We'll see, Sarah said quietly. We'll see what tomorrow brings, and then we'll figure out what comes next. She heard Marcus push away from the door, heard his boots on the porch boards as he walked back toward the main house. Through her window, she watched his silhouette move across the yard, shoulders bent under the weight of a conversation that had solved nothing and changed everything. Sarah lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare herself for meeting the woman who had a legal claim to the man she'd started to care for more than was wise or safe. Tomorrow would bring Catherine Kane back into Marcus's life, and Sarah would finally learn whether the partnership she'd begun to treasure was built on solid ground or just another beautiful illusion destined to crumble under the weight of other people's choices. Catherine Kane stepped off the afternoon stage like she was stepping onto a red carpet at the governor's mansion, her emerald traveling dress pristine despite the dusty journey, her blonde hair perfectly arranged beneath a hat that probably cost more than most families in Millfield spent on clothes in a year. Sarah watched from the window of the general store where she'd been pretending to shop for supplies, her stomach churning as she took in the reality of Marcus's wife. Beautiful didn't begin to cover it. Catherine was the kind of woman who made other women feel like poorly dressed children, the kind who belonged in parlors and ballrooms, not on dusty frontier ranches where the wind never stopped blowing and the work never stopped calling. Marcus was waiting beside his wagon, hat in his hands, his face carefully neutral as Catherine approached him with the measured steps of a woman who knew every eye in town was watching her performance. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation from her hiding place, but she could read the tension in Marcus's shoulders, the way Catherine's smile never quite reached her eyes, the polite distance they maintained even as they spoke. This was not a joyful reunion between separated lovers. This was something else entirely, something that made Sarah's chest tighten with dread. "That's her, isn't it?" Mrs. Patterson appeared at Sarah's elbow, her voice pitched low but carrying the kind of excitement that meant gossip was about to spread through town like wildfire. "That's Marcus Kane's wife, the one who went back east and left him here alone." Sarah nodded without speaking, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "She's a beauty, I'll give her that. But beauty doesn't make a ranch work, doesn't help with calving season or mending fence in a blizzard." Sarah watched as Marcus helped Catherine into his wagon, his movements polite but distant, like he was assisting a stranger rather than the woman he'd married. Catherine settled herself on the seat with the careful precision of someone determined to maintain her dignity no matter the circumstances, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her spine straight as a fence post. They drove out of town without looking back, leaving a wake of whispered speculation that would keep the town busy for weeks. Sarah finished her shopping with mechanical precision, buying supplies she didn't need just to have an excuse to stay in town, until the knot in her stomach loosened enough for her to breathe properly. By the time she finally drove her own wagon back toward the ranch, the sun was beginning its slide toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of all the evenings she'd spent on Marcus's porch, talking and laughing, and foolishly believing that maybe she'd found something worth keeping. The main house looked different somehow as Sarah drove past it toward her cabin. Lights burned in windows that were usually dark by this time, and she could see two figures moving around inside, shadows against the warm yellow glow. Catherine's presence changed everything about the place, made it feel foreign and unwelcoming in ways Sarah hadn't expected. This wasn't her home, had never really been her home, and now she was just an intruder in someone else's marriage, someone else's life. Sarah unhitched her horses and settled them in the small barn behind her cabin, taking longer than necessary with the task, just to avoid going inside where she'd have nothing to do but sit and imagine the conversation happening between Marcus and Catherine. What did separated spouses say to each other after 2 years apart? What did a woman like Catherine want from a man like Marcus that she couldn't get from the civilized society she'd chosen over frontier life? A knock on her cabin door just after full dark made Sarah's heart jump into her throat. She'd been expecting it, dreading it, but still wasn't prepared for the sight of Marcus standing on her small porch, his face drawn and tired in the lamplight. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice rough with something that might have been exhaustion or desperation or both. "Is that wise?" Sarah asked, not inviting him in, not sure she wanted to hear whatever he'd come to tell her. "Your wife just arrived after 2 years. Shouldn't you be with her, working out whatever brought her back?" But even as she said it, she stepped aside to let him enter, because despite everything, despite her hurt and confusion and fear, she still cared what happened to him. Marcus stepped inside and immediately filled the small space with his presence, making the cabin feel even tinier than usual. He stood near the door as if he wasn't sure he was welcome, his hat in his hands, his eyes avoiding hers. "Catherine wants a divorce," he said without preamble, the words dropping between them like stones into still water. Sarah felt her breath catch, felt hope and fear war in her chest in ways that made no sense at all. "That's good news, isn't it?" she asked carefully. "That's what you wanted, what you've been waiting for." But Marcus's expression didn't look like a man who'd just been given what he wanted. He looked like a man who'd been handed a gift that might explode in his face. "She wants the ranch," Marcus said quietly. "All of it. The land, the cattle, the buildings, everything. She's claiming that since she contributed to the purchase price with her dowry money, she's entitled to half the assets in the divorce settlement." Sarah's stomach dropped as the implication sank in. If Catherine got half of everything Marcus owned, there wouldn't be enough left to sustain the operation, much less support a partnership that was already barely profitable. Can she do that? Sarah asked, sinking into her chair because her knees suddenly felt too weak to hold her. Can she just show up after 2 years and demand half of everything you've built? But even as she asked, she knew the answer. Women had fewer rights than men in most legal matters, but when it came to marriage and divorce, the laws could be surprisingly favorable to wives, especially wives with family money and lawyers. Her father hired lawyers, Marcus confirmed, his voice flat with defeat. Good ones from Denver. They've been researching territorial law looking for precedents. Catherine says if I don't agree to give her half of everything, she'll drag the divorce through the courts for years, tie up all my assets, make it impossible for me to operate the ranch. He ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture that now seemed heavy with despair rather than just frustration. Sarah stared at him, trying to process what this meant for her, for the partnership they'd built, for the life she just started to believe might be possible. And if you do give her half, she said slowly, there won't be enough left to make the ranch viable. There certainly won't be enough to support a partner. The words tasted bitter, tasted like all the other dreams that had been snatched away just when she'd started to trust them. I don't know, Marcus admitted, finally looking at her with eyes that held too much pain and not enough hope. I honest to God don't know what happens next. Catherine's lawyers are coming out tomorrow to do a full assessment of the property, to determine exactly what she's entitled to. Until then, we're all just waiting to see how much of my life gets carved up and handed over to a woman who couldn't wait to escape from it. Sarah felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, the recognition that once again she was about to lose everything she'd started to care about through no fault of her own. Where does that leave me? She asked quietly. Where does that leave our partnership? Because she needed to know, needed to start preparing herself for whatever came next, needed to begin the process of protecting what little remained of her heart. Marcus moved closer, his expression desperate now, reaching for her hands but stopping when she pulled them away. It doesn't have to change anything between us, he said quickly. Whatever happens with the divorce, whatever Catherine takes, you and I can still work together. We can find another place, start over somewhere else. The partnership doesn't have to end just because this one does. With what money? Sarah asked bluntly. With what resources? Marcus, if Catherine gets half of everything, you'll be starting over with nothing, same as me. Two people with nothing don't make a partnership. They just make two people with nothing. She stood and walked to her small window, looking out at the darkness that seemed to press against the glass like a living thing. I have some money saved, Marcus said behind her. Not much, but enough to maybe lease land somewhere, start small. But Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice, could hear that he was grasping at possibilities that felt more like desperate hopes than actual plans. And what about Catherine? Sarah asked, not turning around. What about your wife, who apparently wants a divorce but also wants to take everything you own? What does she really want, Marcus? Because women don't travel across the country after 2 years of separation just to file legal papers. She could have done that from Denver. The question had been nagging at her ever since she'd seen Catherine step off that stage, poised and confident, and definitely not acting like a woman who simply wanted to end an unwanted marriage. Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah finally turned to look at him. His face had gone pale, and something flickered in his eyes that looked almost like fear. She wants me to come back east with her, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She says the divorce is just one option. She says if I'm willing to sell the ranch and move back to Denver, we can try again. Start over in a place where she can be happy. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her grip the windowsill to keep from staggering. Of course that's what Catherine really wanted. Not just divorce and half his assets, but Marcus himself, the man Sarah had been foolish enough to start caring about, foolish enough to start imagining a future with. And what did you tell her? Sarah asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her felt like it was crumbling. I told her I needed time to think, Marcus replied. I told her it wasn't a decision I could make in one evening. But Sarah could see the conflict in his face, could see that part of him was actually considering it. Catherine offered him a way out of the mess his life had become, offered him the possibility of starting over with someone who'd already committed to loving him, someone who had legal and moral claims on his loyalty. "Maybe you should," Sarah said quietly, the words scraping her throat raw. "Maybe you should go back east with her, try to make your marriage work. That's what people do, isn't it? They honor their commitments, they work through their problems, they don't give up when things get difficult." Even as she said it, she hated every word, hated that she was pushing him toward a choice that would destroy any chance they might have had together. Marcus stared at her like she'd slapped him. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "Do you want me to go back to Catherine, to pretend that the last 2 years never happened, that what we've built here doesn't matter?" His voice was rising now, edged with something that might have been panic or anger or both. "What I want doesn't matter," Sarah replied, turning back to the window so she wouldn't have to see the expression on his face. "You're married, Marcus. You have obligations, responsibilities, vows that you made in front of God and witnesses. I'm just the hired help, remember? Just the partner who was supposed to help you run your ranch until your real life caught up with you." "That's not fair," Marcus said, and Sarah could hear him moving closer, could feel the heat of his body behind her. "You know that's not what you are to me. You know that what we have here is more than just a business arrangement." But Sarah couldn't let herself believe that, couldn't afford to hope that she meant more to him than the woman who wore his ring and bore his name. "Do I?" Sarah asked, finally turning to face him. "Do I know that, Marcus? Because from where I'm standing it looks like your wife shows up with lawyers and ultimatums, and suddenly everything you offered me is on the table for negotiation. Everything except me. Nobody's asking what I want, what I choose, what I'm willing to fight for." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying months of accumulated frustration and disappointment. Marcus reached for her then, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made her want to cry. "Tell me," he said urgently. "Tell me what you want, what you choose. Tell me what you're willing to fight for, because I need to know. I need to know before I make any decisions about Catherine, about the ranch, about any of it." Sarah stared into his eyes, seeing her own desperate hope reflected there, seeing a man who was drowning and looking for something solid to hold onto. She wanted to tell him that she'd fight for him, fight for them, fight for the life they'd started to build together. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, had been falling in love with him since that first evening on his porch when he'd asked her about her dreams instead of her failures. But Catherine Kane was sleeping in his house, wearing his ring, carrying legal documents that could destroy everything he'd worked for. And Sarah had learned too well that love wasn't enough, that wanting something didn't make it possible, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was walk away before they got completely destroyed. "I want you to be happy," Sarah said finally, the lie tearing at her throat. "I want you to make the choice that's best for your future, even if that choice doesn't include me." She pulled away from his touch, stepped back until there was safe distance between them. "Your wife is beautiful, Marcus. She's educated, refined, connected to people with money and influence. She can give you things I never could, open doors I don't even know exist." "I don't want doors," Marcus said desperately. "I don't want society connections or refined conversation. I want someone who understands why I love this land, why I need to work with my hands, why I'd rather watch the sunset from my own porch than attend a dozen fancy parties." His eyes searched her face, looking for something she couldn't afford to give him. "I want someone who sees me for who I am instead of who they think I should become." Sarah felt her resolve wavering, felt the treacherous hope trying to unfurl in her chest again. But then she thought about Catherine's perfect dress, her confident smile, her lawyers and ultimatums and legal claims. She thought about the town gossip, about what people would say about a divorced man taking up with the widow he'd rescued from auction, about the scandal that would follow them wherever they went. "Sometimes what we want isn't what's best for us," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes the right choice is the hard choice, the choice that hurts but protects the people we care about from worse pain down the road." She moved toward the door, needing him to leave before her resolve crumbled completely. You should go back to your wife, Marcus. You should figure out what she's really offering, what she's really willing to give you if you come home with her. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, staring at her like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then his shoulders sagged, and Sarah saw something die in his eyes, some hope or dream that had been keeping him going through all of this uncertainty. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "if that's really what you think is best." "It is," Sarah lied, opening the door and stepping back so he could pass through it. "It's what's best for everyone." She watched him walk away into the darkness, his figure disappearing into the shadows between her cabin and the main house where his wife was waiting. Then she closed the door, leaned against it, and finally let herself cry for all the dreams that seemed destined to die before they ever had a chance to grow. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of voices carrying across the yard from the main house, sharp words that cut through the morning air like broken glass. Catherine's voice, high and imperious, demanding something that Marcus's lower rumble kept refusing. Sarah dressed quickly and stepped onto her porch, telling herself she was just checking the weather, but really straining to catch fragments of the argument that would tell her whether her sacrifice the night before had been worth anything at all. "You cannot seriously be considering staying in this godforsaken place." Catherine's voice rose high enough to be clearly audible. "Look around you, Marcus. Look at what you've become. You're wasting your life on dirt and cattle when you could be building something real, something important back in Denver with my father's connections." Sarah could see them through the kitchen window, Catherine gesturing dramatically while Marcus stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in the stubborn line Sarah had learned to recognize. "This is real," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from repeating the same argument too many times. "This land, this work, this life I've built here, it's more real than anything your father's money could buy me in Denver." But Sarah could hear something else in his voice too, a weariness that suggested he was losing the will to keep fighting, that maybe the easier path was starting to look more appealing than the right one. Sarah turned away from the window, unable to bear listening to them negotiate her future like she was livestock to be traded or discarded. She had work to do, cattle to check, fence to mend, all the tasks that had given her life structure and purpose over the past few weeks. Maybe if she kept busy enough, kept moving enough, she could outrun the pain that felt like it was trying to tear her chest open from the inside. But as she walked toward the barn, she heard the kitchen door slam and footsteps on the porch. "Sarah," Catherine's voice called across the yard, sharp with authority. "Sarah Mitchell, I know you're out there. We need to talk." Sarah froze, her hand on the barn door, every instinct telling her to run, to saddle a horse and ride as far away from this confrontation as possible. But running would only delay the inevitable, and Sarah had learned long ago that facing hard things head-on was usually better than letting them chase you. She turned slowly to see Catherine Kane standing on the porch in a blue silk dress that probably cost more than Sarah had ever owned at one time, her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, her green eyes bright with the kind of predatory intelligence that made Sarah's skin crawl. This was not going to be a friendly conversation between women trying to work out a difficult situation. This was going to be a battle, and Catherine had come armed with weapons Sarah couldn't even name. "Mrs. Kane," Sarah said carefully, walking closer but staying well out of reach. "I'm surprised to see you up so early. City folks usually prefer to sleep past sunrise." It was a small dig, but Sarah couldn't resist it, couldn't resist reminding this perfect woman that she was the outsider here, the one who didn't belong on a working ranch. Catherine's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I've been up all night, actually, thinking about my situation here, about Marcus's situation, about your situation." She stepped down from the porch with the graceful precision of a woman who'd been trained in deportment, who knew how to carry herself like she owned whatever space she occupied. "It's quite complicated, isn't it? All these overlapping interests, all these competing claims on my husband's attention." "I don't have any claims on your husband," Sarah said firmly, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. Our arrangement is strictly business, a partnership that benefits both the ranch and my need for employment. Nothing more complicated than that. But even as she said it, she could see from Catherine's expression that the other woman didn't believe her, could see that Catherine had read between the lines of whatever Marcus had told her about their living situation. "Oh, my dear," Catherine laughed, a sound like silver bells with all the warmth filed away. "Do you really think I'm that naive? Do you think I don't recognize the signs when my husband has developed feelings for another woman?" She moved closer, circling Sarah like a cat stalking prey. "The way he says your name, the way he defends your presence here, the way he looks when he talks about the work you do together. Marcus was never good at hiding his emotions, even when it would be wise to do so." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, felt the betraying flush that would tell Catherine everything she needed to know about Sarah's own feelings. "Whatever you think you see, you're mistaken," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "Marcus offered me work and independence when I needed both. I'm grateful for that, but gratitude isn't the same as affection." "Isn't it?" Catherine asked, stopping directly in front of Sarah, close enough that Sarah could smell her expensive perfume, could see the calculation in her eyes. "Then you won't mind if I tell you what I've decided about our little situation here." The words carried the weight of ultimatum, the promise of devastation wrapped in silk and social graces. Sarah's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm listening." Because whatever Catherine had planned, whatever weapon she was about to deploy, Sarah needed to know what she was facing, needed to understand exactly how her world was about to be destroyed this time. Catherine's smile widened, and Sarah saw real cruelty there, the kind of casual viciousness that came from never having to face real consequences for causing pain. "I've decided to be generous," Catherine said, her tone suggesting that generosity was the last thing on her mind. "I'm going to give Marcus exactly what he thinks he wants. I'm going to agree to the divorce, let him keep his precious ranch, let him play at being a frontier cowboy for as long as it amuses him." Sarah blinked, confusion replacing dread. That's good news, isn't it? That's what Marcus wanted, what he's been hoping for." But Catherine's expression suggested that good news was not on the agenda, that this apparent generosity came with a price that would make Marcus wish he'd never met either of them. "Oh yes, it's wonderful news for Marcus," Catherine continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "He gets his freedom, his ranch, his independence. He gets to keep pretending that this rough, lonely life is somehow more noble than the comfort and security I could provide him back in Denver." She paused, letting the moment stretch until Sarah's nerves felt ready to snap. "The only condition is that his business partner finds employment elsewhere. Immediately." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, doubling her over with the force of understanding. Catherine wasn't being generous at all. She was being strategic, eliminating the competition while making it look like magnanimity. Marcus would get his divorce and his ranch, but he'd lose the woman who'd become the heart of both, and he'd have no choice but to accept it because refusing would mean losing everything else he'd worked for. "You can't do that," Sarah said, but even as the words left her mouth she knew Catherine absolutely could do exactly that. Catherine held all the legal cards, had all the social advantages, could make demands that Marcus would have to accept or lose everything in a prolonged court battle he couldn't afford to fight. "Can't I?" Catherine asked, tilting her head with mock confusion. "I think you'll find that I can do whatever I choose. I am, after all, still the legal wife of the man who employs you. I have every right to express concerns about the propriety of his living arrangements, especially when those arrangements involve a woman of questionable reputation living alone on his property." The threat was clear, wrapped in the language of social respectability, but carrying the force of legal action. Sarah felt the familiar cold recognition of defeat settling in her bones, the knowledge that once again she was going to lose everything she'd started to care about to people with more power and fewer scruples than she possessed. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Catherine's smile turned triumphant, the expression of a woman who just confirmed her victory. I want you to pack your things and leave, she said simply. Today, this morning, before Marcus realizes what's happening and tries to interfere with what's best for everyone involved. She reached into her reticule and pulled out an envelope thick with bills. I'm prepared to offer you traveling money, enough to get you settled somewhere far from here. Call it compensation for the inconvenience of finding new employment. Sarah stared at the envelope, at the money that represented her price, the cost Catherine was willing to pay to remove her from Marcus's life. And if I refuse? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Catherine hadn't come this far, hadn't armed herself with lawyers and ultimatums, to be defeated by simple refusal. If you refuse, Catherine said, her voice turning hard as winter stone, I'll make sure that every person in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman you are. A desperate widow who seduced a married man, who tried to break up a marriage for her own gain, who has been living in sin with another woman's husband. Her eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. I'll make sure no respectable person will employ you, house you, or even speak to you in public. You'll be ruined, Sarah Mitchell, completely and utterly ruined. Sarah felt the trap closing around her like iron jaws, felt the weight of Catherine's social power and legal advantages crushing any possibility of resistance. This was what defeat looked like when delivered by a woman in silk gloves and a perfectly arranged smile. This was how lives got destroyed by people who never had to face the consequences of their cruelty. Marcus won't let you do that, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus was one man against Catherine's family money, her legal team, her social connections. He was already fighting for his ranch, already stretched thin trying to save what he'd built. Could she really ask him to sacrifice everything he'd worked for just to protect her reputation? Marcus won't have a choice, Catherine replied confidently. He'll be too busy dealing with divorce proceedings and property settlements to worry about defending the honor of his former employee, especially when defending you would mean losing everything else he claims to care about. She held out the envelope again, waving it slightly like bait for a trap. Take the money, Sarah. Take it and disappear before this gets uglier than it already is. Sarah looked at the envelope, at the blood money Catherine was offering for her absence, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not defeat, not the familiar resignation that had carried her through so many losses before, but something harder, something that tasted like iron and burned like whiskey. Catherine Kane might have all the advantages, might hold all the legal and social cards, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that Sarah Mitchell would run when threatened, would fold when pressured, would choose the safe path over the right one. No, Sarah said quietly, the word dropping between them like a stone into still water. I won't take your money, and I won't disappear like some guilty secret. If Marcus wants me to leave, he can ask me himself. If he wants to end our partnership, he can look me in the eye and tell me so. But I won't be bought off or scared off by a woman who thinks she can purchase whatever she wants with Daddy's money. Catherine's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, surprise flickering across her features before being replaced by cold fury. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. You're making a very serious mistake, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Maybe, Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her felt like it was shaking apart. But it'll be my mistake to make, my regret to carry. I've been making my own choices and living with the consequences for long enough to know the difference between the right mistake and the wrong surrender. She turned away from Catherine's furious glare and walked toward the barn, her spine straight and her steps sure despite the fear clawing at her throat. Behind her, she heard Catherine's sharp intake of breath, heard the rustle of silk skirts as the other woman whirled and stalked back toward the house. Sarah didn't look back, didn't give Catherine the satisfaction of seeing doubt or fear on her face. She'd drawn her line in the sand, made her choice about what she was willing to fight for and what she was willing to lose. Now she just had to live with whatever came next. But as she saddled her horse with hands that shook only slightly, Sarah wondered if she'd just made the bravest decision of her life, or signed her own death warrant. Catherine Kane was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and Sarah had just declared war against an enemy with more weapons and fewer scruples than she'd ever faced before. The battle for Marcus Kane's future was about to begin in earnest, and Sarah was no longer sure she had any chance of winning. The sun climbed higher over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was riding toward the end of everything she'd started to believe was possible. Whatever happened next, whatever price she'd have to pay for refusing to disappear quietly, she'd face it standing upright with her choices intact. Sometimes that was the only victory a person could claim, the only triumph that couldn't be bought or stolen or destroyed by people with prettier clothes and uglier hearts. Marcus crossed the yard at noon, Catherine watching from the window like a predator. "Catherine told me about your conversation," he said without preamble, "about the money you refused." "Did you wish I'd taken it and disappeared?" Sarah asked, her heart hammering. Marcus reached for her hands. "I thought you were the bravest woman I'd ever met," he said simply, "fighting for something worth dying for." His eyes burned into hers. "I was a fool to think I had to choose between my ranch and the woman who made it home." "What about your wife, the divorce settlement?" "Catherine made her choice 2 years ago," Marcus said fiercely. "Sarah Mitchell, marry me, be my true partner, help me fight for something that belongs to both of us." "Yes," she whispered through tears. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll fight for us." Marcus pulled her close as glass crashed inside. Catherine appeared on the porch, screaming, "This isn't over. I'll see you both ruined." "You're right," Marcus called back calmly. "This isn't over, because I'm finally ready to fight for what matters." Catherine's face went white before she disappeared inside. "Are we insane?" Sarah asked quietly. "Maybe," Marcus admitted, cupping her face. "But I'd rather be crazy with you than sane without you. You're worth more than gold to me, Sarah Mitchell." He kissed her softly. "Worth fighting for." The widow they'd sold for pennies had found someone who knew her true value, and together they would prove that love was worth any price.